Wind slid like knives between the shuttered storefronts, and the winter night smelled of rain that couldn't quite decide whether to fall. Sable Kincaid used the warmth of her breath like a small lantern cupped between frost-stiff fingers, counting the seconds it lingered before the air stole it. The city kept moving without her, headlights passing, windows gold and far away, lives arranged behind glass and heat, while she measured comfort in inches. The worn wool of her blanket, the hot paper cup someone had handed her 2 hours ago, the borrowed corner beneath the pharmacy awning that dripped in a slow, relentless rhythm. She knew the rhythm. She'd learned to listen to it the way creatures learn to feel the approach of storms. Tonight it said, "Stay low, be small, conserve." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The bike came first as a sound, thin and stubborn against the wind, a metallic heartbeat trying to outrun the cold, then as a streak of matte black skating to an uncertain stop at the curb. The rider cut the engine. Silence inhaled. A figure swung a boot to the ground and stood swaying a little, the way people do when they've been pushing their luck for too many miles. He took off his helmet, and the night immediately touched his face like an unkind hand. He wasn't the kind of man Sable would have approached a year ago, back when she still had a kitchen drawer that caught on its rails, a couch that sank responsibly under the weight of a body, a key to a door with her name whispered behind it. Leather jacket, patchwork of pins and road dust, forearms braided with ink like maps only he could read. But the cold had its own way of flattening hierarchy. Tonight, he was a human being whose teeth were beginning to chatter, and she had something that could hold back the wind for 2 bodies instead of 1. "Bad night to argue with the carburetor," she said, voice soft and steady so it wouldn't wobble like her knees. "You look like you lost that argument." He looked over, eyes a pale, startled gray that made her think of the Atlantic off-season, steel under clouds. "Battery won the debate," he said, managing a smile that was more apology than charm. "I swear she was purring 5 minutes ago." Sable glanced at the sky, a lighter black to the east, the kind that sometimes surrendered into sleet near dawn. She knew what came next for him. That jacket would stop the wind until it stopped, and then the cold would find every place he'd been brave enough to leave unzipped. She didn't ask permission. She didn't think about the ways men could be dangerous, or the times danger had worn a polite face. She moved closer. The blanket pooled in her arms like a lover she could no longer afford to keep, and lifted one half toward his shoulders. "You'll be a headline. Frozen biker makes embarrassing statue on 3rd Street. Here." He hesitated just long enough to show he'd been raised with the kind of pride that made accepting help an extracurricular. Then he stepped into the blanket, and Sable wrapped both of them in that faded wool that smelled stubbornly of lavender from a laundry room she could remember almost clearly if she didn't try too hard. They were shoulder to shoulder, strangers threaded together by necessity. Heat happened the way it always does between creatures trying to survive, quietly, surprisingly fast. "Name's Rook," he said after a minute, breath fogging the air, then drifting back to moisten the wool at Sable's cheek. "Silas Benetti, if you want the DMV version, but no one who likes me calls me that." "Sable," she answered. "Kincaid. No DMV version currently in circulation." He laughed then, a real sound that pushed back the wind for the length of a heartbeat. The bike clicked as its metal exhaled. Across the street, a bus spilled passengers who hurried past with their faces turned down, as if rain could be avoided by refusing to meet its eyes. "What are you doing out in this?" he asked, then flinched a little at his own question. "Sorry, that's probably an obvious answer." Obvious, but not simple. She let the words hang. People wanted origin stories. They didn't always earn them. They stood like that until the tremor in his shoulders softened. She felt the weight of his gratitude in the way he tried not to lean. Pride was its own weather system. She recognized it. She used to live under it, forecasting success in weekly increments, believing good choices made good futures, like recipes made cakes if you followed instructions. Then a layoff had blown the roof off her predictability, and a landlord had smiled like a sympathetic dentist while tipping a balance that had already been leaning. Sometimes the distance between having a home and borrowing a corner was the width of a single bill with the decimal point in the wrong place.
"Can I—" Rook started, then stopped. "This is weird. Is there something I can do for you that isn't insulting?" Sable felt the question land in the place behind her ribs where laughter and crying were roommates who didn't speak. "You can stop apologizing," she said, "and you can tell me if your phone has a flashlight. I can hold it while you check the connections." The smile again, but smaller, warmed from the inside by something like relief. He dug into a jacket pocket, produced a phone wrapped in a case that had more scars than she did, and tapped the light awake. They went crouching together, two people who had not planned to share anything tonight, into the shallow glow that made a small theater of asphalt and chrome. The battery terminals were eaten with the white crust of neglect. The lead from the regulator wobbled under Sable's finger like a loose tooth. "Maybe you lost the argument because you didn't bring any tools to the debate," she said. "Hand me the quarter in your left pocket." He blinked. "You can tell that because—" she said, suppressing a grin because it felt dangerously like the person she used to be, the one who could afford to be clever. "Also, I can hear it click." He produced the coin with an expression of respectful disbelief. Sable used it to snug the loose terminal, knuckles whitening as she put more of herself into the turn than the metal expected. The wind took a breath. Somewhere up the block, a siren cleared its throat and moved on. "Try her," she said, stepping back to give the bike room to live. Rook straddled the machine, rolling his shoulders as if reminding himself they belonged to him. He turned the key, the headlight blinked. He thumbed the starter. The engine coughed, then caught, with a sound like a beast reluctantly deciding not to die yet. His face softened in a way that made him look younger and less defended. "You're a wizard," he said, and because the night was cruel, his eyes shone like water trying not to be ice. "Can I at least get you a hot breakfast? I know a spot. They let in people like me and people like you, same amount of suspicion." "Breakfast is a luxury I can schedule. What I need is your jacket for 10 more minutes. You can keep the blanket." He didn't argue this time. He got off the bike, shrugged out of the leather like a snake unhappy to lose a skin that had seen him through weather and worse, and set it around her shoulders with a carefulness that told her he'd be good at changing a bandage. The lining was warm where he had been, and the weight of it made Sable's skeleton feel acknowledged. They walked the block to the all-night diner whose neon promised comfort in a font that had been chosen when optimism was cheap. Rook parked the bike where he could glare at it from the window like an anxious parent at a playground. Inside, they sat at the far booth, the one with the least glare from the fluorescent bulbs overhead, and watched the world's oldest coffee arrive in a carafe that apologized without words. The waitress clocked their combination, road leather and thrift store coat, boots that walked purposefully, and boots that walked because there wasn't anywhere else to go, and set down a plate of pancakes as big as a discouragement. "On the house," she said to Sable, not unkindly. "Don't tell my manager." Sable didn't say thank you the way people do when they expect generosity to arrive like buses that are merely late. She said it the way you say it when the world remembers you exist, and it startles something human back into a sitting position inside your chest. Rook tried to pay, and the waitress let him put down a 5, like a man laying flowers somewhere the guard doesn't notice. Then the two of them ate in a rhythm Sable recognized from all the kitchens she'd worked in. Quick mouthfuls when the food is warm enough to remind your body it's worth being inside, then slower bites when your stomach throws up a hand and says, "We need to discuss capacity." "Okay," Rook said, when the pancakes had become a memory with syrup at the edges. "I'm trying again to ask the question without screwing it up. Are you okay? Like, do you want to be anonymous tonight? Or do you want someone to see you and remember your name?" Sable looked down at the leather jacket pooled around her and the chipped coffee mug with a crack so old it had become part of the design. She measured the impulse to keep herself folded. It had kept her alive, that folding.
But it had also made her feel like a paper crane that had forgotten it could be unfolded back to a square that said, "This is what I was before art made me into a decorative problem." "I don't have a lot of good history with being remembered," she said at last, "but I'd like to not be invisible every day for the rest of my life." Rook nodded, like she just described a mechanical problem he could fix if you gave him a socket set. "Okay," he said. "Tonight, I remember. And I'll ask a question that lets me help in a way that isn't about making myself feel like a hero. What do you need, Sable? Not the kind of need that sounds polite. The real list." She watched his face while she built the courage to answer. He held eye contact, the way a mechanic holds a tool, gentle pressure, respect for torque, a promise not to strip the thread. "Warmth," she said. "Shelter that isn't bargaining with a security guard. A place to keep a small bag without it becoming somebody else's idea of found treasure. A shower that doesn't require asking permission. I can get work if I can stop looking like someone who needs pity more than she needs a paycheck." She hesitated. "And this is stupid, but I want to hear music without worrying I smell bad." Rook smiled so softly the fluorescent lights seemed to blink more kindly for a second. "Music is not stupid. It's maintenance for parts you can't see." He pulled his phone again, thumbed it awake, then frowned. "This sounds creepy, but I promise it's not. I want to text a friend. He runs a tool drive for folks in the trades who hit a rough patch. He knows people who don't ask the kind of questions that feel like cross-examinations. No addresses, no full names, just community, behaving the way it's supposed to." Sable felt the air move inside her chest in a way that wasn't strictly breathing. Hope was a dangerous engine. It flooded easily. It seized if you revved it without oil. But she didn't tell him no. She nodded once. He typed. Across the street, dawn argued with the horizon in a language made of thin light and stubborn dark. They left the diner just as the first sleet decided to become itself. Rook helped Sable into the passenger seat, of warmth the leather still held, then put the jacket back on her shoulders because she didn't give it back and he didn't ask. When the engine coughed and then steadied, he revved it once, less for the machine and more for the feeling, and asked, "Anywhere I should bring you?" "Anywhere with a roof that won't evict me before the hour is up, but I need to get my bag." It wasn't much, a canvas backpack with a zipper that had learned to compromise, a plastic folder with copies of a life, a book with a bent spine she had found in a free box and rationed like chocolate. She had tucked it behind the vending machines in the bus depot, because cameras watched there, and thieves prefer shadows to the kind of lights that asked, "What are we doing?" They rode the 8 blocks in a wind that made the bike a small ship, Rook's body an engine guard, Sable learning the stewardship of leaning. The depot sat half asleep, the kind of building that made promises about arrivals and departures that didn't always include happy endings. Inside, the vending machines hummed like defeated bees. Sable slipped behind them, reached into the wedge where she had wedged her wedge of a life, and produced the pack with the relief of a magician retrieving the right dove from the right scarf. When she turned, a security guard was watching. He wore the uniform boredom of someone who had learned indifference as a posture, but his eyes were tired in a way that made Sable think of grandfathers and domino tables. "You're not supposed to be back there," he said out of duty, not malice. "I wasn't," Sable said, hoisting the bag so the gesture said, "See, nothing dramatic. We're leaving." He looked at Rook, the leather, the patches, the engine idling outside like a promise, and decided to let the movie continue without the scene where he made everyone hate him. He nodded. "Stay warm," he said, which in this city was both benediction and practical advice. Back on the street, Rook gestured toward the bike like a man offering the last seat on a lifeboat. "I know a church that runs an emergency room in the basement, not the hospital kind, the life kind. They'll be open for an hour. It's not perfect, but it'll get you a cinder block wall between you and the wind, and I'll ask around about something better." Sable wanted to argue that she didn't need charity. Pride is a stubborn animal. It dislikes being leashed in public. But she wanted that wall more than she wanted to perform independence for strangers who wouldn't applaud. She nodded. The bike carried them through streets that were forgetting how to be in focus. The church basement smelled of coffee and lemon disinfectant. Folding chairs made a geography of short-term hopes. A woman with a badge that read Marceline and a smile that was both fierce and credible guided Sable to a cot and pointed at a row of plastic bins labeled with words that could fix an hour: socks, gloves, toothpaste. Rook hovered just enough to be present and not enough to meddle.
"This is where I leave you for a bit," he said, when the color had returned to Sable's face and the kind of exhaustion that lets you sleep in your shoes had softened her posture. "I'm going to go bully a battery into righteousness and run an errand. Come back in an hour?" "Or don't," she said, meaning it more bravely than she felt she did. Relationships started in crises often didn't survive the first calm day. She knew that from the way storms fix strangers into temporary families and then politely dissolve them when the sun remembers how. He touched 2 fingers to his helmet in a soft salute. "You fixed something for me I couldn't fix alone," he said. "Seems right," I returned the favor. Sable slept the kind of sleep that doesn't ask permission from worry. When she woke, the basement had turned into a quiet puzzle of people, shape-shifting into their next tasks. Rook hadn't returned. She told herself she wasn't keeping score. She thanked Marceline, pocketed a travel-sized toothpaste, like a coin from a country that rarely visited, and climbed the church steps into the kind of morning that made you feel like a screensaver had been left running on the sky. Outside, the city had changed very little. It rarely does for individuals. The wind respected her new socks for exactly 10 minutes before negotiating their warmth away. She found the pharmacy awning by the cart tracks in the concrete, and the way her body remembered that corner, the way old horses remember gates. The blanket was where she'd folded it, patient as a dog with a good temperament. She wrapped it around herself and the jacket, and sat down with the sense that maybe the universe had nudged her 1 centimeter toward a different trajectory. She listened. The city has a prelude before something unusual happens. It gathers itself, like a breath, before a confession. Sable heard it first in the way the street seemed to dilate, then in the distant rumor of engines that weren't individual vehicles so much as a moving weather front. She looked up the avenue, and the horizon was a string of low thunder stitched together with chrome. Rook rolled into view at the front of the procession, like a punctuation mark that had been saving itself. Behind him, the block filled with motorcycles, the way a meadow fills with wind, gradual, then all at once. Helmets gleamed, patches glowed. People on the sidewalk took out phones the way villagers lift their faces when rain finally arrives. Sable stood. Without remembering, she told herself not to make sudden movements in front of crowds. The engines idled, an animal throat clearing. Rook cut his and took off his helmet, hair crushed by purpose, eyes bright with a kind of joy that frightened her because she didn't know how to file it. He dismounted and walked toward her with the careful steps of a man carrying something fragile inside his chest. Behind him, men and women with the kind of faces that belong to people who have argued with the road and often won, leaned on their handlebars and watched Sable the way farmers watch a seed they've all decided to protect. "I made a call," Rook said, stopping at a distance that said, "I won't touch your life unless you wave me closer." And then a few more. I told one story. Yours. A blanket on a bad night. The way you saved a stranger and didn't make him pay in shame. He swallowed. I thought maybe 3 or 4 brothers would show up to say thanks, but some stories travel like fire on dry grass. He stepped aside so Sable could see past him. The avenue had become a river of leather and steel, stretching farther than her ability to count. Some of the jackets bore patches I recognized from headlines, symbols that made bar owners put away the good glassware when the rides came through. But what she felt wasn't fear. It was the heat of so many engines at idle, the attention of a community bending toward her like a tree inclines in a high wind and somehow doesn't break. Rook's voice went rough. "We don't do sense," he said. "We do loyalty. We do debts that aren't the kind money pays. You gave me 10 degrees of warmth and a little dignity. It turns out that's a currency that spends in places I didn't even know I had accounts." Sable's mouth opened, then closed. Language is a toolkit. Hers felt empty. She looked at Rook, at the road-creased faces behind him, at the way the city had made room without asking why. A truck rumbled to the curb from somewhere behind the procession, a flatbed carrying something under a tarp strapped with more intention than usual. The tarp rippled in the winter wind, edges snapping like flags on a day the nation remembers itself. The driver hopped down, small, wiry, wearing a patch that said Lark, and a grin that could have been a threat in a different story, but in this one was a sunrise. "You the one with the blanket?" Lark asked Sable, like the question had been rehearsed and deserved a ceremony. "I am," Sable said. The words felt like they had mass. "Then this is yours," Lark said, slapping the side of the tarp with a palm as casual as a benediction. "We're just arguing about whether to make it a bow or a ribbon cutting." The crowd laughed, a sound that skittered across chrome and came back warm. Rook reached into his jacket and produced a key ring. It jingled like a small idea growing muscles. He put it in Sable's hand without closing her fingers over it, so it could still be a dream if she needed it to be. "It's not charity," he said quietly. "It's reciprocity. You fixed my night with 10 ounces of wool and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. The people behind me have memories like elephants and hearts like engines. We talked, we argued, we voted the way we do when it matters." "What is it?" Sable asked, the question a whisper, because anything louder might shatter a geometry that felt improbable as wings growing where bone had been. Lark shrugged, wickedly pleased. "You'll have to tell us when you peel back the weather." Sable stared at the key, at the tarp, at the road lined with eyes that had decided to be on her side for at least as long as the engines could idle without making the cops visit. Pride lifted its head like an animal about to argue. Need put a hand on its neck and stroked it quiet. She stepped toward the truck, because the only way to find out what kind of story you're in is to move forward. Her fingers caught the tarp's edge. The wind tried to make a partner of it. The strap buckles sprang like a thought realized too late. She pulled. The tarp skittered back with the obstinacy of something that had hoped to keep its secret longer. Rook's hand hovered near hers, offering balance and nothing more. The first corner came away, then a second. The shape underneath resolved from rumor to fact, and Sable felt her knees telegraph to her brain that sudden collapses were on the menu if she didn't distribute the weight of this moment wisely. She lifted the last fold, and the crowd inhaled as one, a sound so precise it felt like a drum cue. What lay on the flatbed was not a bundle of coats or a crate of canned goods or a hastily bought motel voucher. It was the skeleton of a small house wearing skin, a tiny home on a flatbed, cedar-sided, windows fierce against the gray, a door painted the kind of red that makes luck reconsider its schedule. A porch light the shape of a question mark waited near the doorbell, as if asking, "Are you ready to come inside?" Sable reached for the door handle with a hand that belonged to all the versions of herself who had waited under awnings and been kind anyway. The metal was cold and very real. The key in her other hand felt suddenly, impossibly, perfectly cut. She glanced at Rook, at Lark, at the line of engines breathing behind them, at the faces that had decided to throw their noise on the side of her quiet. Her mouth formed the first syllable of a thank you that was too small for what stood before her. And then from the far end of the block, a siren turned the corner and accelerated, light strobing red, blue over chrome and cedar, and the stunned radius of a woman about to open a door. The procession tensed, loyalty bracing itself into a wall. A voice on a megaphone cracked the air. "Everyone disperse, now!" Sable's hand was on the knob. The tiny home shone like a promise with a target painted on it. Rook looked at her, then at the approaching cruisers, and made a decision that emptied his eyes of everything but intent. "Turn the key," he said. She did. The lock clicked, the door shifted under her hand, and the first cruiser skidded to a stop 10 feet from the flatbed, the officer inside already reaching for something that could turn a gift into an argument. The door swung inward. Warmth breathed out, cedar and new paint, and the electricity scent of a place that hadn't yet learned to hold secrets. Sable stepped over the threshold as the megaphone ordered impossible things, and the world balanced for a breath, between a miracle she might claim and a storm that was about to break.
This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The cold did not care about miracles or mistakes. It licked the steel of the flatbed, curled under the lip of the tiny home's door, and tried to make a ghost of Sable's breath as she stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was the light, soft, honeyed, turned low like someone who respected new eyes. The second was the quiet, not the hush of secrecy, but the expectant silence of a room that knew it was about to be named. She put her palm on the wall the way you touch the shoulder of a friend you hope to meet again, felt the faint hum of power in the wiring, and then the whole street yanked at the moment with a megaphone. Disperse! Outside, the engines answered with a choir of throats. Sable's heart made a small sprint and then remembered the discipline of walking. Rook's voice cut through the command, low, calm, carrying its own authority. Hold the line, helmets on, hands visible. Sable looked back over her shoulder. Rook stood square between the cops and the flatbed, visor up, palms show empty, but posture unnegotiable. The wall of bikes behind him bristled, not with weapons, but with will. Lark hopped down from the driver's seat and raised both hands like a referee who knew which team was playing more than a game. "Officer, we've got a permitted conveyance, no amplified sound, and the property's title holder is right there." She pointed at Sable. Sable felt the tremor of absurdity. Me, a title holder? Her name had not been paired with the word holder in so long it sounded like a foreign language trying on a familiar word. A sergeant moved forward, shoulders speaking fluent skepticism. He scanned the sea of patches and chrome, landed on Rook, then on Sable in the doorway like a punctuation mark he wasn't sure how to use. He said, "Ma'am, what exactly is this?" Sable's mouth found the answer while the rest of her body stood in the doorway of everything. "It's a home. It's mine." The sergeant's face showed the math. Protest, plus bikers, plus media phones, plus an unexpected woman with a key. He lifted his chin at Rook. "You can't block an arterial, you know that." Rook nodded once. "Give us 10 minutes to move the flatbed and we'll flow like water. We're not here to fight your job. We're here to finish ours." The sergeant stared at Sable, then at the tiny home, cedar siding like a promise, red door like a heartbeat. Somewhere behind him, another cruiser rolled up, lights painting razors across chrome. The gathered crowd shifted into a listening silence that pressed at the sergeant like weather. He said, 5 minutes. No stunts, no burnouts. Clear the middle lanes first." Rook touched 2 fingers to his helmet, acknowledgement without subservience. Helmets dropped, engines answered. The river of bikes resorted itself with the choreography of people accustomed to being accused of chaos while practicing discipline for survival. Lark jogged to the flatbed's winch, shouted, "Keys, Queen," and Sable tossed them with the still awkward accuracy of someone relearning how to be trusted with small metal things. The tiny home eased off the curb with surprising grace, tires whispering over the steel deck, the porch light winking like it knew a secret about gravity. Rook walked beside it like a best man escorting a bride, scanning the edges, calling small corrections. Sable stood in the doorway because stepping back out felt like a superstition she didn't dare to test. She kept one hand on the jam, fingers spread to feel the tremble when the load stepped down onto the street.
"Clear!" Lark shouted. 2 blocks east, then south. Construction site lot. Owner's expecting us." The sergeant blinked. Owner? Rook didn't give him room to grow new objections. Non-profit contractor, permit in the window, insurance verified, he said as if reading from a checklist he had personally tattooed on the inside of his skull. We did our homework while you were driving here. The sergeant worked his jaw, then radioed something Sable didn't hear. He waved the second cruiser to pull up parallel and run interference. The procession began moving, engines sinking to a march. People on the sidewalks clapped because sometimes a city remembers how to behave like a village. Someone yelled, "We love you, Sable!" And she looked up, startled that her name had made it past the circle of Rook's mouth and into the wild where strangers could use it kindly. They turned east. The sleet had become a snow made of unraveled thread. It hissed on leather. It tried to ghost the red door into anonymity. The tiny home moved at a patient human pace, like it wanted Sable to memorize every doorway they passed in case stories needed to be told later about how it arrived. 2 blocks, then south. A chain-link gate had been rolled back at a construction lot fenced with signs about liability and futures. A small team waited there. Hard hats, clipboards, the nervous joy of people about to do something bureaucrats would have to admire once they ran out of ways to object. A woman in a fluorescent vest checked the VIN plate like a customs agent making sure a miracle had its paperwork. Lot C7, northwest corner, pads poured last night. Pads, Sable echoed, tasting the word. She had slept on cardboard, on bench slats, on compressed metaphors that called themselves mattresses. Pads sounded like something you could build a life on without apologizing. The tiny home rolled to the corner where 4 rectangles of concrete waited, like a patient hand. The crew guided the flatbed into place. Rook hovered at Sable's elbow, close enough to be gravity and far enough to avoid being a cage. "Step back inside," he murmured. "It'll settle smoother if you're part of its weight." Sable did. The floor shifted, a boat finding its water. The walls hummed. Somewhere inside the skeleton, a beam sighed, the way houses do when they realize they'll be asked to hold secrets as well as roofs. The winch whined, the straps sang. Then the world went very still. Lark cut the engine and hopped down, grinning like he'd gotten away with stealing Christmas and planned to confess later just to see the look on God's face. "Ladies and gentlemen, and officers of the peace, we are parked." Applause cracked like dry sticks in a campfire. The sergeant put both hands on his belt and studied the scene like a man trying not to smile at a joke his superiors would hate. "You got 30 minutes, then clear the street. I didn't see a thing." Rook turned to Sable. "You ready?" "For what?" Sable asked, which was exactly the honest question it sounded like. "For your first walkthrough, and the part where you decide what this house is called." He took one step back, and Sable took one step forward, because there are moments when your feet make decisions your mouth would talk you out of. The red door was ajar where she'd left it. She pressed it open, wider, and crossed the threshold as if it were a border she had paid too much to reach. Inside was a narrow living space with a built-in bench under a window, cushions tufted in charcoal cloth that felt like rainy day sweaters, a tiny kitchen with a 2-burner stove that winked at her like a friend who knew how to boil water and trouble, a sink with a gooseneck faucet taller than her pride, open shelving that waited like a blank page. Across the way, a ladder led to a sleeping loft where a mattress lay wrapped in plastic like a present modest enough to blush. A closet ran under the stairs, 1 door, 1 rod, 1 shelf, an architecture of dignity. The bathroom door was half open, and inside a compact shower stall looked prepared to forgive everything. Pinned to the corkboard by the kitchen was a sheet of paper, a typed list titled, "Welcome Home, Sable." It itemized utilities on temporary hookups, instructions for the heater, a phone number labeled Anytime. Underneath, someone had written in Sharpie, "This place listens. Tell it who you are. M." She was crying before she knew it, tears quick and practical like rain that means business. The sound in her throat embarrassed her. Then she realized no one in the doorway was trying to rescue her from it. That was a kind of mercy she hadn't known how to request. Rook's voice stayed in the frame of the door. "You can shut us out," he said, "or you can let us in. Both are acceptable answers. We guard whichever you choose." Sable walked to the sink, turned the handle, and watched water arrive as if it had been practicing this entrance. She cupped her hands and drank. It tasted like stainless steel and promises. When she turned, the entire threshold was listening. "I want to name it the Bravery," she said, then shook her head, surprised by her own objection. "No, that sounds like a ship. It's not about being brave. It's about not being alone." She looked at Rook. "Call it the Company." Rook's smile was small and devastating. "Then welcome to the Company," he said, and for the first time since the night began, Sable felt the room agree with the man. The crowd outside didn't swarm so much as rearrange itself. People approached in twos and threes, each with a contribution handed over as if they were paying a toll to cross into a kinder version of the city. A bag of groceries, a set of plates, a thrifted lamp that looked like it understood bedtime. A kid in an oversized hoodie offered a potted basil plant with 2 leaves and an attitude. Sable took each item like an oath and placed them with the carefulness of a person defusing a bomb made of loneliness. Marceline arrived in a coat that could have been a tent and hugged Sable with the brisk efficiency of someone who had hugged 1,000 emergencies and made most of them behave. "We'll get you into the housing assessment system under your terms," she murmured in Sable's ear. "This is not a temporary shelter. This is a permanent address. Use it." She pressed a folder into Sable's hands. Birth certificate request forms, state ID checklist, medical clinic vouchers. She grinned. "Bureaucracy is just a door. We know the hinges." The sergeant cleared his throat and did the government version of peeking in. "You folks about done?" "5," Rook said, and the sergeant held up both hands as if to say, "I asked because I had to." When the bikes had finally thinned to a safe handful and the lot had to look respectable again, Lark hoisted himself onto the flatbed, cupped his hands around his mouth, and called, "Roll call." Patches turned. "Head count, 400 strong," he announced with a pride that stepped right up to arrogance and winked. "Add 1 more if anyone messes with Sable." Sable blinked. 400? She asked Rook. He rubbed the back of his neck, a boy caught doing something grand and trying to act casual. "I underestimated how fast your story would travel. It turns out it rides faster than any of us." They laughed, because the alternative was to cry again and salt the wood. By mid-afternoon, the lot had become almost ordinary. The construction crew packed their caution tape and competence. The cops drifted away to more explicable problems. A pair of local reporters who arrived late and disgruntled left earlier than they had planned, carrying the solemn faces of people who had accidentally documented Grace. In the sudden quiet, the company clicked and settled like a cat finding the shape of a lap. Rook lingered on the step, 1 boot on the ground, 1 on the threshold, as if he didn't want to presume on either gravity. "He's there one more thing. I didn't want to bring it out with the crowd. Felt like it belonged to a smaller room."
Sable folded her arms in the leather jacket she'd forgotten to return and nodded for him to continue. He held up a key, smaller than the red doors, brass dulled by history. "It's for the storage cage at Bonetti Motors, my dad's shop." He cleared his throat. "There's a tool roll in there with your name on it. Marceline told me about your certifications. HVAC apprentice, sheet metal, basic electric." Sable flinched, not because he was right, but because he had said the words in the present tense. "Were," she said carefully. "I was those things." "You are those things," Rook corrected, with a mechanic's stubborn belief in fixable outcomes, "and you'll be paid for being them. My dad needs a bench tech who knows the difference between a ground and a good excuse. You can say no. I'll still show up with groceries and basal grief counseling." He took a breath. "But if you say yes, you start tomorrow." Tomorrow had been a kind of fiction for Sable for months, a calendar square that repeated and asked nothing. It suddenly became a door. She felt the thrill and the terror of stepping through. "I don't have the right boots," she said, as if that were the floor the decision needed in order not to float away. "I know a guy," Rook said, smile tilted. "Worst case, we cut down a pair from Lark and tell his ego it's a charity case." She laughed, which felt indecent and exactly correct. "I'll come," she said, "on one condition." Rook tensed up like a man bracing for a reasonable demand he desperately hoped he could meet. "Name it." "You stop looking at me like I'm a miracle. I'm a person who had a bad stretch and a good night. That's not sainthood. That's statistics." Rook's expression softened into something that could climb a ladder without looking at its feet. "Deal," he said, "but I reserve the right to be impressed by your torque specs." Night fell as if someone had drawn it down by a pulley. The lot emptied. Marceline left last, the basil plant tucked into the window where it could glare at the cold. Rook stood at the step, hands in his jacket pockets, as if school had let out and he wasn't sure whether to go left or right. "Go home," Sable said, gentle but firm. "You've been awake on my behalf long enough." "I don't exactly do home," he admitted, looking past her at the little red door like it was a painting he couldn't afford. "Then go to your upstairs, and come back tomorrow with coffee you pretend isn't terrible. Copy that?" He touched the door frame with one finger, the way people touch the forehead of someone they're not allowed to kiss. "Sleep inside, Sable Kincaid." She shut the door. The click of the latch felt like a witness. She locked it because the lock needed to practice being on her side. She turned off the porch light because the night deserved to see the company without help. Then she climbed the ladder and peeled the plastic from the mattress, the way you peel the past from the future. Crackling, awkward, satisfying. The first time she lay down as someone with a door between her and the weather, the ceiling felt too close, like a shelter used to cover someone else's story. She breathed. The room learned her exhale. She fell asleep with one hand under the pillow and the other on the wall, just in case believing required touch.
In the morning, the world did not explode. This impressed Sable. The basil had decided to be greener. The heater made a noise like a polite throat clear and then committed to being warm. She showered with a joy she kept dignified out of respect for the memories of all the sinks where she had begged water to do its best. Rook arrived with coffee that wasn't terrible because he had misread her joke. He also brought boots, work pants that respected knees, and a battered lunch pail whose dents looked like stories. "Borrowed from every size 8 cousin I have," he said. "Don't tell them I think you're cooler." Benetti Motors smelled like oil and relief. Sable stood in the doorway and felt the same "it fits" click she'd felt in the company, but tuned for a different key. Workbenches lined the walls like old soldiers. A radio, low in the corner, muttered truths about the 70s. A woman with silver hair and sleeves of ink that would make a gallery ask for wall space looked up from a carburetor like she'd been expecting Sable since the shop was built. "You must be my new favorite," she said. "I'm Lucia. I taught Rook everything he knows and half of what he thinks he invented." Sable smiled, small but sovereign. "Sable," she said, "I can solder without burning the thing you love, and I can swear in 3 languages when a bolt refuses reason." Lucia cackled. "You're hired retroactively." She handed Sable a shop rag. "Let's see if your hands kept their memory." They had. The morning slew by in a rhythm that made time behave. Problem, tool, fix, wipe, nod. Lucia watched with a practiced suspicion that softened into approval so gradually it felt earned. At lunch, Rook produced sandwiches whose contents were held together by faith and wax paper, and the 3 of them ate on the steps out back where the alley made shade. "Why bikes?" Sable asked, because she needed to know the mechanics of the man who had stood between her and a megaphone. Rook shrugged. "Because they tell the truth," he said. "If you don't maintain them, they teach it to you the hard way. If you treat them right, they'll forgive things you should have known better about. People are similar, but messier." He glanced at her, then away. Also, because when you're on one, your head has to be where your hands are. It's medicine for worry. Medicine for worry. Sable tucked the phrase like a business card into the pocket of her mind. The week arranged itself around labor and small victories. Marceline marched Sable through the maze of identification with the ferocity of someone who needed the system to behave in front of her. Smile like you own the DMV, she advised. It confuses them into competence. On Thursday, Sable held a plastic card with her picture and the state seal, doing its best to look like trust. She stared at the address, Lot C7, Northwest Corner. It looked silly and exacting. It looked like a place. The basil put out a second leaf. Sable named it Reckless and apologized when she forgot to rotate it. At night, the company learned her steps and stopped squeaking at unnecessary moments. She found herself talking to the walls, not the way people do when they've forgotten language, but the way people do when they're teaching a new friend their habits. Keys on the hook, knife sharp, heart soft. We'll practice. She played music low enough not to make enemies, and high enough to make the air remember how to be air. Sometimes she caught herself waiting for the knock that meant someone wanted to take something. It didn't come. She slept like people do when they've found the muscle that locks the door on fear and discovered it doesn't cramp if you use it. Winter crawled forward. The day the first light snow actually stuck, Rook arrived with a scarf he claimed had lost a fight with a dryer. Humility accessory, he said, looping it carefully. His hands paused at her neck. The pause was not accidental and not unkind. Sable stepped back a fraction. Not rejection, but calibration. His smile said he could read blueprints. When trouble finally arrived, it did what trouble always does. It wore a suit. A man with a clipboard and a tie that looked offended by the weather showed up at the lot with a colleague who had unfortunately practiced his frown until it became permanent. Code enforcement, Ty announced, flashing a badge with the speed of a magician who did not want you to notice the trick. We've had a complaint.
From whom? Marceline asked, sliding into place as if she'd been summoned by the scent of expensive cologne. Anonymous, Frown said, making the words sound like a prayer's opposite. Tiny structure on industrial lot. Occupied. He eyed the company like it had sneaked into a party without the right shoes. We'll need to post a notice until compliance is determined. Rook's jaw clenched. Sable felt the old reflex flare, packed a bag, fold the blanket, find the awning. She gripped the door jamb and made a new decision because the old one no longer matched the dimensions of her life. What would compliance require? She asked, steady. Ty opened his mouth to deliver a sermon. Marceline cut in like a woman who had eaten ordinances for breakfast. Foundation anchors, electrical inspection on the temp pole, setbacks, sanitation plan, she recited. We have 3 of 4. The inspection's at 2. In, she smiled without warmth, 18 minutes. Frown blinked. Ty deflated a centimeter. We'll observe, he said, the way men do when their authority has been invited to sit down. The inspector arrived precisely 2 minutes late with coffee and the aura of a human being who learned to survive both politics and ladders. He went through the motions with earnest boredom, clicked his tongue at a junction box, smiled at the basil like it was a nephew trying. At the end, he tugged the porch light's chain, watched it glow steady, and nodded. You did it right, he said, signing the paper with an authority Ty could not borrow. Temporary occupancy granted pending final utility trench. Frown frowned harder. Ty flipped his clipboard like a magician doomed to repeat a failed trick. We'll be back, he said, with the same energy cartoons use for villain exits. Bring basil, Marceline advised sweetly. We accept tributes. When they left, Sable sat on the step and shook. Not from fear, but from the leftover adrenaline of not yielding. Rook crouched beside her, elbows on knees. Proud, he said simply, as if that were a tool in a role he wanted her to keep. By spring, the lot sprouted 3 more pads. A second tiny home rolled in on a rainy Tuesday,
Then a third arrived with a new moon. The bikers came not as a storm this time, but as a steady rain. A crew on Saturdays, 2 people on Tuesdays, someone's aunt on Thursdays, with pies the size of improved moods. Lucia taught a welding clinic for women who wanted to repair their own fences and metaphors. Sable discovered she had a gift for teaching safety without scaring people out of trying. On a Sunday in May, the company hosted a dinner at a long table made of construction planks and exaggerations. The basil had turned into a small forest named Reckless & Co. Rook sang quietly to the radio while tightening a bolt on a chair with more personality than balance. Sable watched him and realized that the room had quietly rearranged itself to include the shape of him, not as a crutch, but as a variable in the equation of stability. She stood and tapped her glass with a fork because movies had taught her this was how to ask a crowd for its ears. "Thank you" is too small, but let me try a bigger version. In the story where a woman shares a blanket, the sequel often goes like this. The biker rides away, the blanket becomes a myth, and the woman learns another lesson about the temporary nature of kindness. She inhaled. "You wrote me a different sequel. You didn't make me a mascot. You made me a neighbor. That," her voice unsteadied and then found itself, "that's the engine we're going to keep running, for whoever shows up cold and brave and not asking for sainthood." Rook's eyes shone the way steel does when it's learned to reflect gentleness. Lucia whooped. Lark cried openly and blamed the basil. The next morning, a letter arrived tucked in the frame of the red door. No return address. Sable opened it with the caution she reserved for packages and compliments. The handwriting was precise. "Miss Kincaid, I was the anonymous complaint. I am writing to apologize. I live in the building across the street. I thought I was protecting property values. Yesterday, I watched a dinner that looked like the neighborhood I want. If you will allow it, I would like to donate the vacant lot adjacent to your pads. I inherited it. It has been empty for years because I did not know how to turn money into community. Perhaps you do. A neighbor who was wrong." Sable read it twice, then a third time to the basil, because everyone deserved to be included in miracles that required zoning changes. She walked to the shop with the letter like a relic. Rook read it, then leaned back on his heels and let out a whistle that could have called ships. "Land," he said. "That's a word that changes other words."
"Are we qualified to accept such a thing?" Sable asked, dizzy with scale. Lucia snatched the letter and kissed it. "We are now," she said. "Marceline will make the city write us a love song." It did not happen easily. Nothing worth nailing to a foundation ever does. There were meetings where men tested Sable's patience to determine their own importance. There were signatures that required pens to be refilled with stubbornness. There were headlines that tried to make the bikers and the church and the construction crew into a novelty act. Sable learned to look into cameras and tell the story the way she wanted it remembered. A night, a blanket, an engine that learned to purr again, a door that opened, a community that refused to disperse. On the day the deed recorded, the city clerk smiled like a person who remembered what power was for. "Congratulations, Miss Kincaid," she said. "You are in the land records." Sable stepped out into sunlight and felt taller than her shadow. Rook was waiting on the steps with a helmet under his arm and a question in his eyes like a ring that wasn't jewelry. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "It's loud but necessary." They rode out past the warehouse district, where the river forgot it was supposed to be scenic and concentrated on being useful. They pulled up to a parking lot near a bridge. Rook killed the engine and pointed. "We thought your first homecoming needed music," he said. Down by the water, 300 bikers, some she recognized, many she did not, stood in a loose arc. In the middle, on a makeshift stage built from pallets and gratitude, a small band sound-checked. The singer lifted a hand, the bass knit the river to the shore, and the first chord rolled across the lot like a weather front filled with forgiveness. Rook leaned close so she could hear him over the opening riff.
"I told you you wanted to hear music without worrying you smelled bad," he said. This is the opposite of that moment. Sable laughed, and then it turned into something else, something that cracked open a chamber behind her sternum where she stored reasons. She let the sound happen. People who loved engines cheered like people who loved encores. The song climbed, bent, held, broke, healed. Rook didn't touch her until the bridge. Then he took her hand like a man who had outgrown juvenile bravery and learned the adult kind. Summer taught the company how to sweat politely. The basil forest had to be split into smaller empires to prevent civil war. The lot next door sprouted footings and neighbors. Marceline glowed with the feral joy of a woman winning a long game. Lucia started insisting that Sable take the lead on intake days. She said, "You look like authority people trust. It's your curse now." One evening in July, Sable sat on the tiny porch with her feet on the step and a bowl of cherries in her lap, spitting pits into a jar like a polite delinquent. Rook leaned in the doorway, grease under his nails, jaw rough from a day that had forgotten to include time for shaving. "I have a thing," he said. "You usually do," she said dryly. "No, I mean an ask," he swallowed. "There's a run coming up, charity, out past the ridge. They want a speaker at the halfway point. Somebody who can say something honest about why this matters. I wrote your name. Then I panicked. Then I decided to tell you and absorb the consequences." Sable looked at the cherries, at the basil that had drafted into evening perfume, at the door that had learned the sound of her key. "I'll do it. But I won't preach. I'll story." "Good," Rook said, relief like rain. "They're terrible at being preached at. They're excellent at being told what their hands are for." On the day of the run, 400 bikes throbbed at the starting line like a single animal made of sound. Sable stood on the tailgate of a truck with a mic that had survived worse. She told the truth about a night that cut, about a blanket that covered two, about a coin tightening a terminal, and a door painted red because luck listens when you speak its language. She didn't mention saints, she underlined neighbors. She ended with, "You are not a miracle. You are maintenance for a world that wants to break if no one tightens its bolts." Rook looked at her like she'd handed him a torque wrench and a new reason. Lucia cried because she did that now, without apology. Lark revved his bike and yelled, "Get on with it!" which translated in their dialect to, "I love you, please don't look at me while I do." When the rides rolled out, Sable climbed onto the back of Rook's bike with the competence of someone who had learned how to lean on purpose. The road opened, the river kept its appointment with everywhere. The run raised more money than competence had promised. Back at the company, kids drew chalk houses on the asphalt, each with a tiny basil in the window. On a night so hot that the stars looked like they were sweating, Sable and Rook sat on the porch steps with their shoulders almost touching. The lot was quiet, except for the sound houses make when they exhale. Settling joists, content plumbing. Rook cleared his throat. "I'd like to say something without making your house blush," he said. "Try it," Sable said, amused and wary. "I don't want to be the reason people think you needed rescuing. I want to be the reason people think they can stand next to you while you rescue a whole block." Sable took his hand. "Good," Sable said, "because I don't need a rescuer. I do need a partner who knows when to bring coffee, and when to bring a socket set, and when to bring silence." "Copy that," he said softly, and the porch light chose that moment to flicker on of its own accord, because electricity has a sense of humor. In the fall, an article ran with the headline Sable almost liked. It used words like mutual aid and self-determination, and did not once describe the bikers as a menace tamed by charity. She cut it out, taped it inside the closet where her jackets hung like evidence that bodies survive winters. The first anniversary of the Night of the Blanket arrived cold and bright. the lot filled with engines and casseroles. They unveiled a bronze plaque near the red door that read, "The Company, a house built from a story." Underneath, in smaller letters, "Share warmth, tighten the bolt, don't disperse." Everyone cheered. Sable laughed. Rook kissed her under a wind that had learned manners. Later, when the crowd thinned and the Basil sulked about the temperature, a car idled at the curb with the diffident posture of trouble that hadn't decided whether to disembark. Sable watched in the reflection of the window as a man stepped out, tie, briefcase, hair parted with the exactitude of a man who trusted mirrors more than friends. He came to the bottom of the steps and looked up at the plaque, and then at Sable like a person discovering he'd been living with a crucial word spelled wrong. "Miss Kincaid?" he asked. "Yes," she said, standing because sitting felt like giving away inches. He cleared his throat. "I represent a group of owners 2 blocks over," he said carefully. "We're considering a proposal to develop the riverfront. Condominiums, retail, the usual. We'll need the lots along this corridor." He spread his hands, palms up, as if offering a choice that had been pre-selected. "We're prepared to make you an offer." Rook stirred behind her, a low rumble like an engine considering an opinion. Sable raised a hand and he went quiet, because he trusted her more than impulse. "What kind of offer?" she asked. The man named numbers that would have knocked her down a year ago. They did not today. She listened like a woman in a shop, testing the pitch of a belt. When he finished, he looked pleased with the arithmetic of sympathy and profit. Sable nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. "Here's my counter-offer. You donate twice that amount to the Community Land Trust managed by Marceline. You finance 10 more small houses, built by the same crews who built this. You put in writing that 30% of your units will be permanently affordable to people who actually work within 2 miles of here. You agree the first-floor retail includes a repair shop, a clinic, and a grocery that takes WIC without sighing. In return, we let you share a story where you did not steamroll us." The man blinked like his eyes had been introduced to weather. "That's not how these negotiations usually go," he managed. "It is now," Sable said, as gently as a wrench picking up a nut. "Because we are in the land records, and because the last time someone told me to disperse, 400 engines explain the math of staying." He looked at Rook, then at the porch light, then at the Basil, as if they constituted a zoning board. "We'll be in touch," he said, and retreated to his car where a passenger stared at the company like a thesis that had failed to defend itself. Sable sat back down. Rook's laugh was a thing of beauty. "You just negotiated a city," he said. "I asked for maintenance," she corrected. "Cities break when no one tightens the bolts." Winter returned with less malice, perhaps because the company now had neighbors who knew how to share extension cords and jokes. Sable still kept the blanket folded at the foot of her bed. She still carried quarters in her pocket for reasons the past could explain to the future without shame. Some mornings, she woke and put her hand on the wall to make sure the hum was real. It always was. On a night when the wind remembered the exact angle of the pharmacy's awning, Sable walked past her old corner with a thermos of soup and 2 cups. A woman sat hunched against the tile, blanket drawn up like a battlement. Sable crouched, the way you do when you don't want to loom. "Bad night to argue with the weather," she said softly. "Want to split something warm?" The woman looked up, suspicious, wrapped in exhaustion. She opened the thermos and let the smell tell its own story. She set a cup carefully within reach. "I'm Sable," she said. "There's a place with walls 2 blocks over. It's called the Company. It won't solve Tuesday, but it can make Wednesday less rude." The woman stared at the steam, then at Sable's face. "You live there?" she asked. "I do," Sable said. Because once, a biker's battery lost an argument with a cold night, and a stranger shared her blanket. She smiled. Turns out that currency spends. Footsteps sounded behind her. Rook arrived, not a rescuer, not a shadow, but a man who knew how to stand within reach without taking over someone else's weight. He handed Sable a bag. Extra socks and basil seeds. Reckless had babies. The woman took the socks like the beginning of a better story. Sable poured the soup like a priest who remembered the taste of hunger. The wind slid like knives between the shuttered storefronts, but it found fewer places to succeed. And as the night drew its cold circle around a city learning how not to disperse, the company's porch light clicked on, warm as a law rewritten. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.